soft, icy wind, a faint crackle of a low-burning fire. Somewhere in the distance, church bells strike midnight. Winter speaks differently than other seasons. It doesn't shout or roar or throw its weight around like a summer storm. Winter whispers. It settles around you in layers, snow, silence, shadow, until the world feels muffled and closed, like someone leaning in to tell you a secret or a warning. And nowhere does winter whisper louder than in the long nights leading up to Christmas. Imagine a room in the late 1800s, a parlor glowing with oil lamps, frost thickening on the window panes, a small fire crackling. People are sitting close, their breath visible in the cold pockets of the room the fire hasn't yet tamed. And then someone says, "Shall I tell you a ghost story?" And everyone leans forward. Not because they're surprised, but because this is tradition. On this podcast, we will wander into the winter dark to a time not so long ago when Christmas was the season of specters, when hauntings were exchanged as casually as gifts, when the dead walked the snow-covered streets more freely than any caroler. I am Gregory Hallows, and this is Preserve Halloween Podcast. So there's something uniquely haunting about the Victorian winter. It isn't simply the cold, though the cold was harsher then, in a lot of ways that a lot of us can barely imagine. I've lived in Chicago, so I've lived in a very freezing climate, and it was not fun, especially the Great Lakes, that wind. Homes were drafty, coal was expensive, streets froze solid, and the fog rolled in like a massive living thing, swallowing the gas lamps and leaving only faint halos of light. Winter was a force, not a season, and into that force the Victorians placed their stories. So many people today think of Halloween as the home of ghost tales, and, it still is. But for Victorians, especially those in the UK and Britain and that area, ghosts belong to Christmas. And it's not because of Charles Dickens, even though, he played his part. It's not because of the great M.R. James, though he perfected the form. But it's because winter is a liminal place, and humans have always listened harder in the cold. Now, Christmas falls just after the longest night of the year. It is the hinge point of winter darkness, and in the centuries before the Victorians, Yuletide itself carried echoes of the old world. Midwinter rituals, ancestor visitations, solstice fear, the wild hunt tearing across the sky. Those memories never vanished, and they just simply took on new clothes. So the Victorians, who were lovers of ritual, of structure, of storytelling, they revived and reshaped something ancient into something new, which became the Christmas ghost story. So I'll guide you through this world, very briefly, not just the literature, even though, I'll mention some of the familiar names, and I'll give you a list at the end of the podcast. Not just the traditions, but, those always matter. But I want to explore the mood and the atmosphere and the mindset of this time frame. The Victorian winter ghost story wasn't written to terrify you the way that modern horror does. It was written to chill you gently, like a draft across the back of your neck, to give you the pleasurable shiver that reminds you, in the dark, we are never truly alone. And for you to understand this tradition, let's just imagine this moment. The lamps are turned low, snow's begun to fall outside, and they're, slow, heavy flakes that are drifting like ash. You can hear a clock ticking in the background from the mantle, or these huge Godfather clocks. Someone stirs the fire and sparks jump like startled fireflies. It is late. It is quiet. And in that hush of the night, a voice begins. Sometimes it was your father or your mother telling a familiar old tale. Sometimes it was a friend recounting something that happened to a cousin or someone else in their younger days. And sometimes it was an original story that was written specifically for that night. The point wasn't terror. That's the important part. The point was the gathering around the fire, and the fire, fire's ancient symbol of warmth and life, and just acknowledging the shadows just beyond the glow. But I go back to this on a lot of podcasts. Storytelling is so very important. Which brings us tonight to our first anecdote, which this is a new thing for the podcast. A short and chilling tale told in the spirit of Victorian Christmas parlor tales. So this is something called Footprints in the Snow. They say that one Christmas Eve in a small northern village, a widowed school teacher noticed footprints outside her cottage just after midnight. They came right up to the door, and then they stopped. There was not a turnaround step. There was no retreating steps. The steps just ended. Assuming a neighbor had walked past, she went to bed. But the next morning, after a fresh snowfall, she saw the same footprints, same size, same shape, same one-way pattern, and they just ended at her door. Now, this happened again on December 26th, and then again on December 27th. But on the 28th, heavy snow fell all night, and not a single person should have been outside. But there they were again, footprints, crisp and deep, stopping at her door. Worried, she finally opened it. And there, lying on the doorstep, was her late husband's walking cane, the one buried with him 5 years before. She moved away the very next day. So, Victorians loved stories like that. They were unsettling, they were creepy, but they weren't grotesque. It was something that lingered like cold breath on a window. But the real heart of this tradition is in the way that Victorians understood winter. Winter was introspective, winter was a time for reflection, and winter was supernatural. Unlike summer, a season of labor and long days, winter forced people inside, inward, literally and mentally. It was a time for imagination and for contemplation and for memory. And ghosts are the children of memory. So winter encouraged people to think of those who were absent, the people that they lost during the year, those who once sat beside them by the fire, and those who would never again join them at the table for Christmas. Ghost stories became a way of bringing those absences back into the room, but only if for a moment. But let's go deeper into this tradition, to the publication culture that shaped how much it spread. So, Victorian Christmas annually produced special literary editions. They would do magazines, pamphlets, seasonal booklets, and all of these had ghost tales. Families eagerly awaited them the way that some people now will await, a holiday movie. The stories would vary. Some were tragic, some were eerie, some were comedic, but they all touched on that familiar thread of winter haunting. Now here's another. Here we go. We're going to come up with, this is another anecdote. This is the second one. And this is a miniature Victorian style haunting, again, and it's meant to be told in the hush of Christmas Eve. So this is a Christmas Eve story. And this one is The Candle in the Window. There was once a boarding house owner who, every Christmas Eve, placed a candle in the window of her smallest upstairs room. She told guests it was tradition, nothing more, and no one questioned it. One winter, a curious lodger asked why the candle always flickered violently, even on nights without wind. The owner sighed and said, because 30 years ago, a sailor stayed in that room. He promised his sweetheart he'd return by Christmas. She lit a candle for him every night until she died, and now he still looks for it. The lodger didn't believe her until that night when he awoke to the unmistakable sound of dripping water puddling on the floor. He checked the ceiling, dry. The windows, closed. The wash basin, empty. And then he noticed his boots were dripping wet, with seawater pooled around them. he didn't stay past morning. So that's another, really short, just an example of Victorian storytelling. That's how Victorian ghosts work. They were subtle, they were eerie, they were unsettling, more in an implied way than making a grand spectacle. It's like they were gentleman ghosts, or they had culture. But Victorians also loved a moral ghost story, a tale in which spirits delivered warnings or corrected wrongs. Winter was seen as a time of reckoning, a season when one looked back on one's choices. So our third anecdote embraces more of that moral, solemn style. So this anecdote is called The Empty Chair. One Christmas night, a wealthy merchant sat alone in his parlor, counting his accounts by the fire. Outside carolers gathered, poor but cheerful, singing for coins or bread. He ignored them. Hours later, as the embers dimmed, he heard a chair scrape across the floor behind him. Slowly, very slowly, he turned. The chair opposite him, his late daughter's favorite, had pulled itself closer to the fire. No breeze could have moved it. No draft could have shifted its weight. And then came a sound. A child's sigh, small and unmistakably sad. The next morning, he sent baskets of food and coal to every poor family in town. And from that year forward, the chair remained by the fire every Christmas Eve, waiting for the daughter he would never forget. So, this is a story that appealed to Victorian sentiment and morality. It blended melancholy with hope, with sorrow with redemption, and a blend Victorians considered perfect for wintertime. So, now we'll widen our anecdotes to the deeper cultural meaning of these tales. Wandering through drawing rooms, foggy streets, gaslit alleys, frosted graveyards, railway stations where travelers swore they saw figures vanish beside them in the snow. You have to slip into the mindset of people who saw winter as a very thin place, a time when, once again, the veil between the living and the dead was very fragile. But I didn't want to just go into like Dickens or M.R. James or Fanu or Kipling or Rhoda Broughton. They're there as they should be because they're very powerful voices in this genre. But I wanted to kind of explore those in the future. What I wanted to establish with this podcast was the mood, the atmosphere, and to set the table for future episodes, because I really love ghost stories. I really enjoy discussing them. But why did Victorians believe ghosts belonged to Christmas more than any other time? How did the winter darkness influence Victorian psychology? How did coal fog and candlelight and all those early industrial things shape the mood of these stories? What was a fireside haunting? How social issues, both poverty, child labor, class disparity, how did they all seep into this culture of these ghost stories? Why was death always present in Victorian daily life? How did these tales merge with pagan winter traditions and Christian holiday customs? And what happened to make this tradition fade? Because it's not a thing as much as it was. So those are some of the things that I want to talk about in the future with future podcasts. I kind of just wanted to introduce the concept of, this topic on this podcast. Just a short, brief, introduction. But here's the thing. Through the cold streets and the heavy drapes and the fog thick enough to hide any figure that might not belong to the living, the Victorian winter, through laughter, through the, everyone's around the fire and they're in the unlit hallways, and the superstitions and the skepticism, all that was intertwined in these, ivy and stone houses and, just the culture. But through all these concepts and, factors, there's one thing. Winter wants there to be stories. And some stories need the winter. And that's what kind of the basis for this podcast was, just to get to the heart of the reasoning behind these stories and just a little, very brief glimpse, because I want you to be ready for the next episode. Or ready, when I explore this topic further, I'm excited. But as Victorians would say, that is a tale for another Christmas. But I wanted to leave you with some examples if you wanted to explore this topic on your own. These are some authors that you should check out. Of course, Charles Dickens, that's the one everyone knows. M.R. James, which is my favorite, wonderful writer. J. Sheridan Le Fanu, that is Lefanu. Elizabeth Gaskell, Edith Nesbit, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, sorry. We know him mostly for Sherlock Holmes, but there are some Victorian ghost tales there. Margaret Oliphant, Rhoda Broughton, Wilkie Collins, and E.F. Benson. We all, of course, know A Christmas Carol. That's the Charles Dickens story that made all of this very popular. But there are so many other options for Victorian ghost tales. If I'll post this list in the on the podcast, like the notes. And remember, I've started doing this a little bit at the end of each episode. If you want to donate and help me with exploring and researching all these topics, just, donate $1. Like, what is that saying from RoboCop? I'll buy that for $1. Any little bit helps, $1 or, whatever you can spare. It helps me out a lot. It gives me the podcast channel and the hosting and all the things you need to run a podcast. Because I really want to do this more. I love speaking about these topics, and I love, so much stuff is related to Halloween. So, when I first started doing this, never would imagine I could talk about, Victorian ghost tales while I'm spreading the love of Halloween, because it's all relative, right? So, until next time, stay strange, stay curious, stay spooky, and always preserve Halloween.